Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose this podcast, they tend to be more mainstream leaning than anything else. They're certainly films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is very firmly a celebration of cinema, an appreciation of just how difficult it is to make a film, and gratitude really that films somehow get through this whole system and end up on the screens in front of us. Without further ado, I'm going to get on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. And, well, both of them actually come from 1991. But let's kick off with probably the highest profile of them. I'll play you a clip. Come to the story, the other side of this.
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
He's past the others. The last cell. I'll be watching. You'll do fine.
A killer is on the loose.
Keeps them alive for 3 days. Then he shoots them, skins them, and dumps them.
A rookie FBI agent is on his trail.
He's got real physical strength, cautious, precise, and he's never impulsive. He'll never stop.
But in order to track him down, she'll have to match wits.
I'll help you catch him, Clary.
Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head.
With the darkest of all minds.
Just do your job, but never forget what he is.
Oh, he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
So close to the way you're going to catch him. Do you realize that? Oh, Clarice, your problem is you need to get more fun out of life.
You told me you don't spook.
That then is a clip from 1991's The Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme, screenplay by Ted Talley based on the book The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, and the cast led by Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, Scott Glenn and Ted Levine. Now, The Silence of the Lambs was the film that really, on a broader scale, introduced the character of Dr. Hannibal Lecter to modern-day cinema. However, it wasn't the first big screen outing for the character. I think that's pretty much well known that in 1986, Michael Mann, a name we're going to be returning to in the future on this podcast, had adapted the 1981 novel by Thomas Harris, Red Dragon. That became the film Manhunter, with Brian Cox in the role of Lecter, just spelt a bit differently. And the movie was a financial disappointment, although it's one that over time whose reputation has very, very much certainly grown. But when it came out, lost money, and interest in making future Lecter movies just seemed a little bit dampened somewhat. Now, Thomas Harris isn't known as the world's fastest writer. You can read interviews and pieces on just how torturous he finds the process of writing, and perhaps that explains why the gap between the first Lecter novel, Red Dragon, and its follow-up, The Silence of the Lambs, was 7 years. As it would turn out, that would be the shortest gap between Lecter novels, but there's bits of stories there I'll save for another time. But the bottom line here was that The Silence of the Lambs was released in book form in May 1988, and as was par for the course by this point, Hollywood had been fighting it out to get a slice of the action well ahead of that. That early preview manuscripts of the book had been circling to see if Hollywood was interested, and Hollywood was interested. So let's have a look at who was shopping around, because in the first instance, it was Gene Hackman, a man primarily known for his acting, but at this point was on the lookout for something he could potentially develop and direct himself. So there were a pair of problems that were facing him here. That firstly, by 1987 standards, for this was the year before publication that the bidding started to build up on the Silence of the Lambs movie rights. This was going to be an expensive book. That in all the total bill, just to get this to a point where it'd be ready to film, would be about $500,000. And set against that, the problem was that the novel was, well, it was not on the shy side, incredibly violent, very grisly nature of the violence as well. And there were questions amongst the Hollywood fraternity of how do you make that into a movie that could make it into a multiplex and then in turn make a fair amount of money in the process. So let's enter stage left a man called Mike Medavoy, who is going to be part of both of the stories in this episode of Film Stories. But at this stage, he was heading up the company Orion Pictures, and he was convinced that there was a film for general audiences in Thomas Harris's text. So he called around his partners and colleagues at Orion Pictures and just said, you should stump up the money for this. But when his Orion colleagues heard it would cost $250,000 just to get the book rights, another $250,000 to adapt it, they said no. Medavoy didn't have his deal, but there was some tenacity here. He certainly wasn't giving up. And so what he figured he'd do was look for a bit of star power to win his partners over. So there was a confluence of two things here, Gene Hackman and Mike Medavoy effectively, and Hackman at this stage was already doing business with Orion. He'd done Hoosier, the basketball movie, that had done decent business for the studio. Its reputation has certainly cemented over time as well. And he was shooting a new thriller for Orion at that point called The Package too. He was also appearing separately, it's relevant to this story, in Alan Parker's movie Mississippi Burning. And bottom line, he was a busy man. But he still firmly had his eye on this project. He thought he could play one of the roles in it. He had his eye reportedly on the character of Jack Crawford for himself. And then he could direct the film. This would be the one that would launch him into movie directing. Although jumping a little bit ahead of the story, but he's now a retired actor, and Hackman never directed a film throughout his entire movie-going career, so you can sort of guess which way this is all going to go. He was, at this stage, though, he was developing it. I mean, he was interested in Michelle Pfeiffer in the role of Clarice Starling. John Hurt was penciled in for Hannibal Lecter. And Empire in 1991 did a really deep report on the film, and with lots of interviews in it, which I'm drawing on here, as well as Mike Medavoy's book has been a good source for this particular podcast. And so Hackman wanted in and Medavoy wanted in. And so Medavoy brokered a deal that he went to Hackman and suggested that they split the cost. Orion would put in $250,000. Hackman could put in the other $250,000. And that would fish around, just see if Hackman was really interested. Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? And the thing is, he was. And so the deal was put together in a way that Orion would pay the initial $250,000 fee for the rights to the book, and then when it came round to the film actually happening, that's when Hackman would be expected to put his hand in his wallet and pull out a few banknotes. And so by the end of 1987, a deal had been inked here, and so Medavoy had the film set up at Orion, and he was able to go off looking for a screenwriter. And so he settled on a man called Ted Talley. Now, Ted Talley now is an Oscar-winning screenwriter. Again, a bit of a spoiler of which way this story's going. But at this stage, he didn't actually have a screen credit to his name. He was something of a gamble. He'd been writing a film called White Palace for Lindsay Anderson, of all people. But that took some time to get going. In fact, it would be a few years, actually, before it was made without Lindsay Anderson, but with Susan Sarandon and James Spader in the lead roles. It's a good film as well. But that hadn't got off the ground. Still, his reputation around Hollywood was building. And so there was interest in getting him to do some writing work. And the wheels were particularly greased in this case, too, by the fact that Ted Talley had got an early copy of The Silence of the Lambs and liked the book. And also, he sort of knew Thomas Harris as well. So he was roughly in the ecosystem of this one. And so Mike Medavoy hired Talley to write the screenplay. Bob Sherman at this stage was hired by Orion to produce the film as well. Hackman was going to direct. And so Sherman, Hackman and Talley could get down to work. Now, there was one residual problem with the rights that they were battling against. This was another problem for Mike Medavoy to sort, because even though they had the rights to the book and so they could bring The Silence of the Lambs to the screen, what they didn't have was the screen rights to the Hannibal Lecter character. Those rested with Uber producer Dino De Laurentiis. Now, Dino De Laurentiis had been the person who'd secured the rights for Red Dragon and had produced the movie Manhunter. And part of the deal he had with Manhunter was it gave him first refusal deal on rights for future Hannibal Lecter stories. So effectively, he had the movie sequel rights for Hannibal Lecter 2, if not The Silence of the Lambs. And so what had to happen was work on the adaptation of Thomas Harris's book began, and it was centred around a young FBI agent called Clarice Starling, but she was looking for a serial killer called Strang. And so they couldn't use Lecter in the midst of it all. But Medavoy put in a call to De Laurentiis, and he got a slightly surprising result, but De Laurentiis had a bit of a long-term view of this, because Manhunter had lost Dino money, and Dino De Laurentiis did not like losing money, and so he personally wasn't interested in putting another load of dough into another Hannibal Lecter film and potentially losing another load of money. So as far as he was concerned, Medavoy could have those rights gratis. There was going to be no charge, but De Laurentiis knew that if someone else went and made a huge success out of The Silence of the Lambs, then he had the screen rights, or at least first refusal of the screen rights for the next Lecter tale, and so that's the point where he could cash in. And in fact, one little aside to that story was Dino De Laurentiis was apparently so burned by the response, the commercial response to Manhunter, that he didn't even read The Silence of the Lambs. Allegedly, that the pages were not open, so he passed on it pretty much blind. So the screen rights were sorted. That was the bottom line for this particular part of the tale, and Talley was significantly through his first half of the screenplay. And it was around this time that Gene Hackman got cold feet, because he was getting spooked by the violence. And I think it's in the Empire Report that one story suggested that the violence in Mississippi Burning was a factor, that he was sat on Oscar night as Mississippi Burning was up for lots and lots of awards, and so clips of the film were being shown, and they were all violent and very dark clips. And Hackman started to have doubts about whether he wanted to go from such a dark and violent project to basically another dark and violent project. And it didn't take long for him to conclude, no, this wasn't for him at all, and he wanted out of the project. And the problem we had here was that if Gene Hackman wanted out of the project, well, he'd given it a little bit of movie star cachet, and so Orion Pictures, in turn, then started to get the wobbles as well. The star of the film, the director of the film, was pulling out, and the deal that got it funded in the first place was now falling apart. Now, it helped that at this point The Silence of the Lambs had gone on to be a sensation when it was published in the spring of 1988 in the US, and so there was clearly some kind of market for it. And so Medavoy told Ted Talley, just keep going, I'll sort the rest of it out, you keep doing your adaptation. The book was a huge success, and Orion off the back of that was happier to fund the movie and its development, plus it had already spent money on it too. And so Hackman was allowed to bow out of his obligations that he'd made to the project, but Medavoy again struck a deal here. Hackman could bow out and there would be no cost to him, but he would have to surrender his credits on the movie, his fees that he was going to get for the movie, and his profit share on the movie, and then he would be absolutely fine just to walk away. And at this stage as well, as the project was about to take an about turn, Bob Sherman left as producer too. And so Medavoy needed a new director to keep this one going. And what he didn't do was consult his colleagues at Orion. What he did do was he sent it to a youngish man by the name of Jonathan Demme. Now, Demme had already directed 2 films for Orion at this point. On paper, both of them fairly conventional genre pieces, but what Medavoy saw in Demme's work was just something of an edge, a willingness to do just take a couple of gambles with what could be perceived as fairly conventional material. So those 2 films were Something Wild, and the second was Married to the Mob, which featured Michelle Pfeiffer. So those were on his CV, and they showed that he could make a film, that he could find some kind of angle on a film as well. And Medavoy was impressed with him. He was also impressed by the fact that they seemed to demonstrate to him that Jonathan Demme could glide across genres almost effortlessly. I mean, he had also directed the Talking Heads picture Stop Making Sense as well. He'd done a thriller for another studio by the name of Last Embrace, and so whilst no other studio at this point would necessarily have called Jonathan Demme as the top choice to direct a thriller, not least a thriller based on a publishing sensation, for Mike Medavoy, it seemed like a fairly logical idea. And so the script was sent over to Demme, and as Medavoy wrote in his book, he said, "I always knew that Jonathan was something of a critic's darling, which ensured that the film would likely get good reviews, essential for a movie with violent content. His eyes were on the prize, as the cliche goes." And so Medavoy continued, he said of Demme, "His reputation for originality also ensured that quality actors would want to work with him. If The Silence of the Lambs was going to be more than a film about a man who ate people for enjoyment, because it is about Hannibal the Cannibal in the midst of it all, casting would be critical." Now, chatting to Empire, Jonathan Demme reflected that I wouldn't have offered it to me. And he said there was nothing in his earlier films, perhaps the closest he felt was something, his 1974 prison movie Caged Heat, to suggest that he was the right man to direct a thriller such as this. And in fact, Demme was already on the payroll for Orion because he was developing another movie for the studio at that point. But he was interested in Silence of the Lambs. He read the novel, and at that stage was just like, yeah, I can do this. I know how to do this. And so he was able to drop out the other project he was doing for Orion, which was unnamed, and I couldn't dig out the name of it. And he was moved over to be the new director of Silence of the Lambs. And so Talley was still completing his screenplay while all these shenanigans were going on. And Ted Talley and Jonathan Demme met for the first time in May of 1989 to talk things over and to work stuff through. By the end of the year, the movie would be shooting. I mean, after the original bumps just to get it set up, this was about to motor forward at speed. But there were still casting discussions that had to be had. So Jonathan Demme, for instance, still wanted Michelle Pfeiffer for Clarice Starling. But the problem was Clarice Starling in the book is a novice FBI agent. That's the point. She's in training. She's learning. She's in her 20s. And Pfeiffer at that stage wasn't in her 20s. And there was just a slight age difference between Pfeiffer and the character she'd have to play. And also Pfeiffer herself had some doubts over this one. She was struggling to reconcile the darkness and the violence. She had not dissimilar concerns to Gene Hackman over appearing in Silence of the Lambs, and so ultimately she would pass on the project. Now, next in line was Jodie Foster. Now, there's a story out there that Foster herself had reportedly dabbled with the idea of buying the book rights herself around the time that Gene Hackman went shopping. Now, she'd broken through dramatically in 1976's Taxi Driver, of course, when she was not even a teenager at that stage. And a few years previous, she'd won an Oscar for her role in The Accused. And what was different about Foster here was lots of actors were running away from The Silence of the Lambs, scared off by its subject matter and scared off by its violence, but Foster was someone who was actively pursuing it, to the point where Mike Medavoy put her name forward as a possible Clarice Starling to Jonathan Demme, and Demme wasn't entirely sure at first. But nonetheless, Medavoy decided to bring them together for a lunch in Los Angeles. Demme was in New York at this point, so he flew over. And the pair had a couple of conversations, and Demme was leaning towards casting Jodie Foster in the role of Clarice. Foster did have conditions if she was going to take the role on, though. Without wishing to go tabloidy, there was an assassination attempt on then President Ronald Reagan at the start of the 1980s by John Hinckley, who had cited Jodie Foster's character in Taxi Driver, almost as his motivation for doing so. That the story, as reported, was that Hinckley was trying to emulate the Travis Bickle character from Taxi Driver in an attempt to impress Foster. And I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what she went through as part and parcel of that. But one thing that she'd taken away from it was just how impressed she was with the FBI and how, they'd completely earned her respect. That the way they'd handled the death threat that came up against her was something that she was hugely grateful for and hugely admiring of. And so if she was going to take on Silence of the Lambs, she wanted to make sure that the FBI would be portrayed properly, that she had a criticism of Jonathan Demme's previous movie at that point, Married to the Mob, that the FBI didn't get. Well, they don't come out of that film brilliantly. But Demme took these points on board. Foster still wanted the violence to be cut away from as well, that she didn't want it to be utterly grisly on screen. And what they all knew in their heart of hearts, really, I think, was it's sometimes more powerful just to cut away at the key moments, which for the most part is what Demme does in the movie, save for an autopsy sequence. I'm not going to go fully spoilery on it, but there's a little bit of the Bambi effect here, that what you don't show tends to be more impactful if you imply rather than go full in and full grisly. And that was Foster's preference. As it turned out, that would be Jonathan Demme's preference as well. And so basically it was leaning towards Jodie Foster getting this role. But who would be taking on the role of Hannibal Lecter for this one? And one person Demme was absolutely adamant about, and this was a name that wasn't on many people's radars for such leading roles, or certainly such pivotal roles at this point in movies, was Anthony Hopkins. And it was Hopkins' performance in The Elephant Man that convinced Demme that the then 40-something Hopkins could take on the role of Lecter. But he was unquestionably a lower profile choice. I mean, Mike Medavoy wanted someone higher profile. He wanted Robert Duvall. And Jonathan Demme agreed to meet Robert Duvall, but he just wasn't sold. He just felt he brought a profile to the role. And as a result, it just became a little bit more on the nose. Hopkins, meanwhile, I mean, the script was got to him, and one story goes that his agent rang him up and said, "We've got this film coming for you, a script to read, The Silence of the Lambs," and Hopkins made the assumption that it was a children's film at first. All sorts of rumours too about other people who got this and turned it down. I mean, Sean Connery was said to have received the script and described it as, quote, revolting. Daniel Day-Lewis was said to be an option in the midst of it all as well. But Jonathan Demme was pretty adamant that he wanted Hopkins, and so Mike Medavoy again suggested another deal. Why not cast Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter? And then also he agreed to cast Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling. This didn't sound like a massive leap to me from the stuff I've read in and around this, but they shook on that and they got the two leads for the movie. Now, Scott Glenn rounded off one of the lead roles as well, taking on the role of Jack Crawford that Gene Hackman had earmarked for himself at one point. And all of the key actors in this did a lot of research. In the case of Scott Glenn, I think it's pretty well known that as part of his research, he heard tapes of serial killers committing their crimes and was incredibly shaken up as a result of doing so, to the point where there was a question mark about whether he'd over-researched this. Jodie Foster spent an awful lot of time with the FBI and with FBI training. Anthony Hopkins, meanwhile, well, he threw himself into studying serial killers and the files of serial killers, and he went and visited prisons, and he studied murderers, and he went to court hearings, and again, he was listening to the gruesome details involved in an assortment of crimes. And this was what the actors all did, just try and get into the headspace of all of it. But again, going back to Mike Medavoy's book, which is called You're Only As Good As Your Next One, by the way, filming could finally begin on The Silence of the Lambs on the 15th of November 1989. Now that, if you remember, the first meeting that took place between Ted Talley and Jonathan Demme was just months later. I mean, it was a very fast process from the time that Demme came aboard the project. Shooting was going to take place primarily in and around the Pittsburgh area. They did some shots in West Virginia as well. But on the whole, the production of this one was fairly straightforward from this point onwards. I mean, it's quite interesting how Anthony Hopkins found his character of Hannibal Lecter in the movie, because he would describe that the touch points for his performance would be a marriage of Katharine Hepburn, Truman Capote and Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he would explain to Empire as well that in terms of his physical appearance, it was Jonathan Demme's idea that Hannibal Lecter be pale. And he said he convinced me to stay out of the sun. He said it was my idea to give him the dark, slicked back hair. I also wanted him to wear a very tight prison uniform. That would suggest total control. And as Hopkins said, after my first makeup session, I went to the mirror and thought, and he stretched out his arms, this is it. Demme also would say I had very, very, very little to do in terms of talking to him about the character, other than going, that's wonderful, thank you. And the shoot of this one wrapped up on the 1st of March 1990. Now, this gave Orion a decision to make, because Orion Pictures at this stage, even though it was bizarrely just years away from going out of business, had an Oscar contender on its hands. That Oscar contender, to its eyes, in fact to the industry's eyes, was not The Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs was not the kind of film that won Oscars. It was going to be R-rated, it was a horror film, and also it potentially was going to come out at the wrong time of the year as well. But Orion felt that a film going through its cycle at that point, Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves, well, that was primed for an Oscar run. And so what it needed to do was keep other films out of the way of that. It needed to concentrate its effort on Costner's 3-hour Western, and anything else that was in the way was just going to have to move to the side. And that's why The Silence of the Lambs, which was ready effectively for release in 1990, was pushed into early 1991. on the surface, it was pushed into something of a graveyard slot for Hollywood releases. That in the early 1990s, the peak time for releasing films were summer for the big summer blockbusters, and then if you wanted an awards run, it would be autumn, and then another run of big films coming out towards Christmas time. And The Silence of the Lambs was going to premiere in January of 1991, ahead of a wide release in the US in February of 1991. And big films, I can't get this over enough, really. Big films didn't get a release in February. If you had a film that you expected to bring in lots of money, that was not the time to put it out, and certainly not if you felt it had any kind of awards possibility at all. But as it turned out, Orion had accidentally pulled off something of a masterstroke here, because Dances with Wolves had its clear run at the Oscars, and Dances with Wolves would clean up at the Oscars. It took 7 Academy Awards home, it defeated Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas to the Best Picture prize, and then it had The Silence of the Lambs as a relatively big release for early in 1991. I mean, it cost about 19 million to make the film to this stage. It's got a terrific score by Howard Shore, I want to acknowledge as well. And so it debuted in middle of February of that year, and I mean the critical response to it on the whole was really very strong, and particularly the response to the acting performances was off the chart at that stage. Hopkins's performance as Hannibal Lecter was regarded as absolutely terrifying, and then Jodie Foster playing an intelligent FBI agent, and a character who didn't have to shy away from her intellect as well, also came in for real praise. And it's not that every critic was absolutely on board with the film. 1 or 2 high-profile critics came out against it, but the consensus was this was a very, very good film, and it was released on Valentine's Day. It got its wide release in the US, and on its opening weekend, straight to the #1 slot in the US box office with $13.7 million, keeping Sleeping with the Enemy, which I covered a few weeks ago on this podcast, off the top slot. King Ralph was in there. I've covered that before in 3rd. Home Alone was 4th. Dances with Wolves had been hanging around for an awful long time, was in 5th place. And the thing with The Silence of the Lambs was it was, again, in an era of Hollywood where you had a real chance of being a word-of-mouth success, that it just because you got a decent opening box office, if people liked your film and kept talking about it, it could play for a long time. And that's what happened with The Silence of the Lambs. It was #1 at the US box office for weeks. In fact, it took, I think it was only on its 6th week, it was usurped from the top spot by, of all things, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze. But right through mid-February into most of March, The Silence of the Lambs was America's #1 movie, and the money kept coming in, and the international rollout of the film continued to add to its reputation as well. And in all, I mean, it played for an awful long time in US cinemas and got a US gross alone of $130 million by the time it had completed its run. That run wasn't, certainly on its first run as well, wasn't even completed until October of 1991, so it played for about 8 months. But when The Silence of the Lambs went around the world, the money kept rolling in. I mean, another 140 million came in from outside of the US. By the time the film had completed its run in cinemas, $272 million for this one. Dino De Laurentiis would have been in a great mood. But, of course, there was more to the story here, because to the surprise of pretty much everyone in Hollywood, The Silence of the Lambs was building up some serious Oscar buzz. And in spite of the fact that everything was weighted against it, really, it was released at the wrong part of the year, it was the wrong genre, it wasn't the kind of movie that would traditionally get anywhere near even the nominations, The Silence of the Lambs became only the 3rd film in history to win what's regarded as the Big 5 awards at the Oscars. So it follows It Happened One Night and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in taking home Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay. The only awards that it was nominated for that it didn't win were Best Film Editing and Best Sound. And The Silence of the Lambs had completed its journey to becoming an unlikely phenomenon, a huge commercial hit, an incredible critical hit, and also Orion's mantelpiece for the second time in 2 years was weighed down by the weight of Academy Award gold. So a couple of aftermaths of this. I mean, there was some pushback and protest against what's described as the homophobic undercurrents of the film. And it's worth noting that Jonathan Demme, a very intelligent and aware director, and a very much missed one as well, would take something from those comments. And his next film would perhaps be a slight response to it, because he would unite Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington in the movie Philadelphia. The saddest part of the story is that the studio that took the gamble on it would soon be out of business. That even though Orion had potentially two hugely profitable films here in The Silence of the Lambs and Dances with Wolves, the income from both of them just took too long to come into the coffers, and by the time it did start to properly roll in, Orion was filing for bankruptcy and was going out of business. And then it's, of course, worth noting that Dino De Laurentiis, as much as he'd missed out on the finances and the financial upside of The Silence of the Lambs, he would certainly cash in his chips for the next Hannibal Lecter movie. That would be Hannibal, which Thomas Harris would take an awful long time to write, which Anthony Hopkins would be lured back for, and for which De Laurentiis would absolutely take up his option to make. But the story of Hannibal is one for another time on this podcast. So then, we're now at the halfway point of the latest episode, and so I'm just going to do a few parish notices and just quick updates. So first of all, for the first time, adverts have been added to this podcast. The streams have been crossed. So a couple of things on that. I'm not a mad fan of podcasts that are absolutely deluged with adverts, so I'm trying to keep them relatively minimal. The income that they bring will hopefully allow us to do a lot more things with film stories. I don't think they'll make me insanely rich, disappointingly. Anyone who backs this podcast on Patreon, of course, will get the advert-free version, as well as getting the podcast early and all the assorted benefits to that. You can find more information on that at patreon.com/Simon Brew. But if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it outside of the Patreon, then please, if you can subscribe, that helps enormously. If you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps enormously as well. Independent podcasts, that is the lifeblood of them, really, and helps us with whatever algorithms huge multinational conglomerates have come up with this particular month. If you're interested in seeing one of my live shows, well, it's probably cutting it a bit fine for the live show I'm doing with Paul Feig in London on the 5th of October 2022. You can find more on that at filmstories.co.uk. I will be bringing my Movie Geek live show to Birmingham in the UK on the 2nd of November at the Midlands Arts Centre. More information on that is going on the Film Stories website this week as well. And also we've got issue 37 of the Film Stories magazine has gone on sale as well. You can find more on that at store.filmstories.co.uk. But these parish notices are boring the life out of me, so heaven knows what they're doing for you. So I'm going to get on with the second of the two movies I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories instead. Now, this is the best quality version of this trailer I could find. This is a film I really enjoyed growing up. However, it's one that's kind of dropped off the radar a little bit, but I still think there's an interesting story behind it. So we're staying in 1991. Let me play you a clip from the ropey trailer and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
The Regis School for Boys, where the country's best families
Bring that back here!
send the world's worst students.
If you're gonna kick me out, kick me out.
I'd make 4 prep schools in 4 years. You're trying for the Guinness Book of Records?
But these boys are in for a real shock.
If you do not produce my father unharmed, I will begin executing the hostages.
I'm sure by now you have discovered who their parents are.
Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Vice Chairman of the Republican Party. What does your father do, William?
Contractor.
According to this, he owns the 3rd largest construction company in the world.
Yeah, he's a contractor.
My boys, many of them, they have a real problem with authority.
Are you with me or not?
Of course we're with you.
But if you get a shot, we're gonna be PO'd.
So that's nice and loud and crackly, isn't it? That's 1991's Toy Soldiers, directed by Daniel Petrie Jr., written by David Koepp and Daniel Petrie Jr., and based on the book by William P. Kennedy of the same name, starring Sean Astin, Will Wheaton, Keith Coogan, Andrew Divoff, Denham Elliott and Louis Gossett Jr. And this time I'm going to start the story with Daniel Petrie Jr., who at this stage in the annals of Hollywood was a man on his way up, that he'd been screenwriter of Beverly Hills Cop, a film with a story and a half behind it that I will come to in the the future. He'd also co-written and produced Turner and Hooch, starring Tom Hanks and a dog, and that had scored him another success. But also it left him with an ongoing deal with Disney, where he was contracted. But there was a clause in the contract that he had with Disney that while he was looking for a project to direct himself, if another studio came up with something, then he would be given a leave of absence from his deal to go off and make a film elsewhere. So he was on the lookout for something, and it didn't take him an awful long time to find material. So off the back of producing Turner and Hooch, which was directed by Roger Spottiswoode, who would go on to direct the Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, he would then do another film with Spottiswoode called Shoot to Kill. And then in came a potential project that might just lure Daniel Petrie Jr. into the directing chair. And so separately then, Orion had picked up the rights to a novel by from author William P. Kennedy called Toy Soldiers. Now, this was a book that didn't go nuts in the way of The Silence of the Lambs, but it was published in 1988 as well. And it told the story of a terrorist plot to take over a school on the outskirts of Rome in Italy. Not just any school either, a posh boarding school that just happened to be the place where sons of influential American business figures and politicians happened to go. And the idea was, hold the kids to ransom, get what you want, everything fine. What they don't count on is, well, let's just say one or two of the kids fighting back. And so Orion picked this up. It looked like a fairly tidy, low-budget action movie that it could put together. And David Koepp was assigned to screenplay duties on this. Now, this was very early David Koepp as well. So the David Koepp who would go on and write things like Jurassic Park was a little way away. He did have Bad Influence and shortly Death Becomes Her coming to his name at this point. But he was writing it with a director in mind, and a fairly unusual choice, that Toy Soldiers was being moulded for Oscar-winning director John Schlesinger. Now, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you'll know that Schlesinger's name popped up on the last episode when we talked about the 1990 thriller Pacific Heights. And Schlesinger's body of work, incredible. You know, the likes of Marathon Man, the likes of Midnight Cowboy. And so he wasn't necessarily the kind of person you would associate with a low-budget action film with some American teenagers in it, although they weren't American in the original draft. But here he was. I mean, he was at the stage of his career where he was taking relatively commercial assignments, and he was interested. But in the end of it, ultimately, he would drop out of this particular project, and he wouldn't be alone either, because Orion Pictures would drop it as well. I believe the chronology was such that Schlesinger dropped out so he could do Pacific Heights, but I couldn't quite tally that up. But that looks likely based on circumstantial evidence, but don't hold me to it if I'm not entirely correct there. And so with Orion also dropping out, in came an independent production company by the name of Island World that agreed to put up the relatively modest budget to bring this to the screen. It's worth noting that one of the producers of Toy Soldiers listed is a man called Mario Casa, that this was one of his earlier credits. He would go on, well, at this stage, he was part of Carolco. He co-founded that company and would be, the same year, Terminator 2 Judgment Day would come out with his name as producer as well. But for the purposes of this, Koepp carried on writing his script, and he did set it in Europe at this point. The terrorists in the book, though, and in Koepp's original draft of the screenplay, were of Palestinian origin. And never let it be said that Hollywood doesn't love its cliches, because people of Palestinian origin at this stage were the go-to people if you needed movie villains, the absolute cliche as it was. But I think even then there was an awareness, hang on, this isn't quite right. And it was getting harder and harder to get films off the ground where you did have just such cliche, two-dimensional, borderline offensive like depictions of people as straight-out villains. That was said to be one of the reasons why the film was struggling to get proper backing in Hollywood, why it did ultimately go independent in the end. And when Schlesinger walked away, it was offered to Daniel Petrie Jr. The script made its way to him as he was actively looking for something to direct while he was at Disney, and this was the project that Disney released him from his contract for a period of time in order to go and pursue. And I interviewed Daniel Petrie Jr. in an odd job, and we talked at length about this film. And he said to me, when they brought the book to me, they said, we'd like to have a reason that it could be set in the United States and with another villain. And Petrie Jr. admitted, oh, thank God, because even though he said I thought the book was very effective, we'd hit trouble with the plot of going through these cliches, of doing the same tried and tested cliche antagonists in the movie. But also it played to Petrie Jr.'s background moving into the US, because he was a prep school kid. In the American sense, he went to boarding school. He went to a boarding school for high school boys. And one of the things that he learned while he was at boarding schools is basically how to try and circumvent the rules without getting caught. And that is relatively, I mean, it's something that comes up fairly regularly in the final film of Toy Soldiers. And so Petrie Jr. was on board, and he came together with David Koepp, and they refined the screenplay to get to a point where this was looking like it was going to happen. The news that it was going to happen broke in July of 1990. So again, this is a relatively swift film story. That's when Screen International reported, yep, Daniel Petrie Jr. is going to be directing. It is now going to be set in America. That much was confirmed, a very easy decision. And by this stage, 1,000 young actors had auditioned to take part in the ensemble, because Toy Soldiers needed a young cast. That there were roles for one or two older actors to play the teacher, the head teacher, to play the terrorists in the film. But the whole conceit is there's a bunch of boarding school boys who are fighting against international terrorists who are trying to hold everyone hostage. And so they auditioned around 1,000 people. These auditions took place across America. They took place in Los Angeles, in New York City, in Virginia, where they were going to shoot the bulk of the film, in Richmond, in Washington. And what Petrie Jr. was desperately trying to get away from was the cliche at that stage of Hollywood productions casting people who were already in their 20s and early 30s to play late teenagers. I mean, by this stage, Michael J. Fox in my beloved Back to the Future Part 2 was in his 30s when he was supposed to be playing a teenager. But Petrie Jr. didn't want that. I mean, as much as he might have been lent on, and we sort of hinted at this but didn't say it outright, that people like Tom Cruise might have been like put towards this particular film, he was happy to go with relative unknowns, because as long as they were in the age band that he wanted for the film. And so that would be mitigated by the fact that there'd be at least 2 high-profile adult roles, if you like, and those would go to Louis Gossett Jr. and Denham Elliott, both of whom have an awful lot of fun in this movie. One person who went in and auditioned for the film, for the young ensemble, who didn't get it actually, was Corey Feldman. And Corey Feldman talks about this in his memoir, Choreography. And he talks about at that stage in his career when he was auditioning for the movie, he was in, his words, spectacular tailspin. He said, I'm flaking on meetings right and left. I'm supposed to audition for Toy Soldiers, which will feature my friends and fellow co-stars, Will Wheaton, Keith Coogan and Sean Astin. They were all in the ensemble by that point. But Feldman said, I blow off the president of Island Pictures. He says, on our second meeting, I flub all my lines. It just says, I'm a mess. I'm lazy about hiding my habit. I think his addictions were pretty well known at this point. And it just wasn't happening for him. And he didn't take a part in the ultimate ensemble for Toy Soldiers. But as you heard then, there's some names that did. Not necessarily utterly unknown. Sean Astin had been in the Goonies, of course. Will Wheaton, Star Trek, The Next Generation. But still, it was a relatively low-profile cast for the movie. But also, it was a relatively low-priced movie. So there were no real eyebrows raised at that point. Sean Astin, meanwhile, realised that effectively he was taking the lead in an action thriller here. And he writes about that in his book, There and Back Again, An Actor's Tale, which is a book primarily concerned with his work on the Lord of the Rings films, but does touch on some of his other movies. And he said that when he showed up on the set of Toy Soldiers, Mark Berg, one of the film's producers, fairly blanched at my softness in the midsection, he wrote. And Berg said to him, come on, Sean, get to the gym. And Astin admitted he resented it, that he felt at that stage his preparation for the film had got him to a point where he was, quote, sufficiently heroic the way he was. But he also admitted in hindsight he was wrong on this one. He said, I wasn't disciplined enough to take care of my body, which really should be among an actor's most important responsibilities. And he also said, going into Toy Soldiers, I knew the genre. It was an action picture, a smart pubescent thriller. And he described himself as the mini Bruce Willis, even though he admitted in the book as well, I can see Daniel Petrie Jr. cringing while reading this, because he wrote a very sensitive character, and I'm reducing that character, Billy Tepper, to a slim, fast, cautionary tale. The filming could get underway on this one, I mean, relatively quickly after it all was announced in Screen International. So they were on set and shooting by the 5th of September 1990. And this was location-based primarily. For the bulk of the production, the filmmakers took over a real-life school, the Miller School, which is a military academy in the Charlottesville area in the US. But what they needed to do for action sequences in the movie and for one or two more explosive moments, well, let's just say give the school building itself a bit of a tonking. But they couldn't do that to the school as part of the deal they got to secure the location. So they needed a bit of movie ingenuity. So basically they built a fresh quadrangle facility for the school, a fresh feature for it, and they put fiberglass walls around it, which they then attached to the school itself, but just to give the image that it was all brickwork, this extra fake facade that they put together. It basically gave them something to smash up in the midst of all of it. Now, Daniel Petrie Jr. would explain to me, he said that the group of kids really gelled as a group and supported each other. And he also said the adults surrounding them were very nurturing of their younger peers. In particular, he had a lot of praise for Louis Gossett Jr., said he was always very, very generous. That Petrie Jr. said, I would say something to him and he would generously say things like, that sounds good to me, but what does your star think? And he was deferring to Sean Astin on this. And Sean Astin wasn't a high-profile movie star, really. If anything, Louis Gossett Jr. was the one with the Oscar on his shelf, and so he could have been the one calling the shots. But Louis Gossett Jr. was trying to help bring this young ensemble through. Now, Astin, Will Wheaton, T.E. Russell and Keith Coogan, they all passed their time on the set of this one at one stage by putting together a band. Now, that band went by the name of, let me get this right, the Soldier Junkies Screaming Pink Brigade. And again, I'm not really sure it's worth doing a Spotify search for them, but if you want to, you knock yourself out. I'm not going to stop you on that. But as much as I've talked a couple of times about this being a relatively modestly costed film, around that $10 million mark, but it still wasn't without one or two taxing sequences. And in fact, at one stage, they had a chief technical advisor who managed to bring in 3 Black Hawk helicopters, an Apache helicopter, and an assortment of other military equipment for one particular sequence in the film that I don't really want to spoil. But let's just say they also recruited in for that moment, again in a relatively modest film, 54 members of the Virginia National Guard who were recruited to appear as a hostage rescue team in the movie. The film shot for 8 weeks in the Virginia area, and then the production then went off to San Antonio in Texas for 4 days. That was doubling up for Columbia for a sequence at the start of the movie that was going to cause some problems to the film's commercial performance. I should also point out as well that Daniel Petrie Jr. went out of his way to praise the late Denham Elliott for being a really inclusive part of the ensemble for this one as well. And filming could wrap up on the 7th of November 1990. Now, the film would hit something of a stumbling block. It was scheduled for release on April the 26th, 1991, which was indeed where it came out, and the post-production was relatively light. So Island World Pictures wasn't a distribution company, so it needed to sign a deal with a studio who would put this out, and a TriStar picked up the rights for a lot of territories around the world, not all of them, which accounts for the fractured DVD and Blu-ray release of this movie around the planet. But TriStar was headed up by a man called, what do you know, Mike Medavoy. When did we last talk about him? So Medavoy by this point had left Orion Pictures and he'd moved to TriStar. And so this originally had been an Orion film, remember, as well. And Medavoy was regarded as a very filmmaker-friendly executive. He wasn't one to go deep into the post-production and meddle with films unless he absolutely had to. But in this case, I think all concerned probably think in hindsight he should have done. Because the cut Daniel Petrie Jr. developed, edited by Michael Kahn as well, who 2 years later would be editing Jurassic Park. But the cut that they fashioned for this one had a very, very, very violent prologue that wasn't quite in keeping with the tone of the rest of the film, that it could have been effectively. If you watch the first 5 minutes of this, you think you're going to get an 18-rated action movie coming out the other side, rather than a comedic action thriller set in a boarding school. So, the parallel I think of here actually is the movie Kindergarten Cop, directed by Ivan Reitman, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, which also has a really violent opening that goes against the tone of the rest of the film, and that was said to have hurt its box office performance, although in the case of Kindergarten Cop it was up against Home Alone, so that may have been a factor. But for Toy Soldiers, this very violent opening and the odd moment of violence throughout the movie as well would be a problem, really. And the Chicago Tribune, at the point the film was released, described the movie as Dead Poets Society meets Rambo, and that would be roughly in line with the critical response to the film, that the violence of it was really cited as jarring and against the tone of the rest of the picture, to the point where it undermined it. In the UK, it got the film a 15 certificate, and this is the kind of film now that you imagine would play to 12, 13-year-olds, but at that point, you just just couldn't get in. I mean, to all intents and purposes, from the outside looking in, this was being billed as an adult action movie, which really the content of the movie didn't necessarily reflect that, apart from certain chunks of it. Now, I asked Petri Jr. about this, and he did admit in hindsight it might have been a mistake, but he did say, I knew how boys of that age talked, and he said they swear, and I wanted the violence to be real. He didn't want it to be fake cartoony violence, a la the PG-rated Home Alone, ironically. And he said, because it seems to me it's a boy's own adventure story with improbable events, but if there are no real stakes, that the kids are really running risk, then a lot of the enjoyment just goes out of the film. And so the film was released April the 26th, 1991, and it didn't do great guns, really. It certainly didn't make much of a splash at the box office. Its opening weekend, it opened in third place with $4 million. And, I mean, it wasn't massively tough competition. There was the thriller A Kiss Before Dying, which came out from Universal. That was in second place, 4.3 million opening for that. Oscar, starring Sylvester Stallone, his first outright sojourn into comedy, had opened in top slot with just $5 million. So it was a very weak weekend. The other films were around. Well, The Silence of the Lambs was in week 11 at that point, was still in sixth place. What do you know? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 was at 7. Dances with Wolves had been in cinemas for half a year at that point. Half a year, and was in 8th. Steven Seagal's Out for Justice had been the number 1 movie the week before. But Toy Soldiers, I mean, it just spluttered, really. I mean, it hung around the chart. It held on to 4th place the following week. The Michael Keaton headline One Good Cop opened up, and then it was just dropping down the chart to the point where by the time it had finished its box office run in the US, $15 million, and barely much more than that outside of America. I do want to flag up one thing about the film. The score to it is great, and it's by a guy called Robert Falk, and it was a really hard score to get for an awful long period of time. Until I think it was Intrada I picked up the soundtrack CD from in the end. Also, the film itself isn't very easy to find either. I think it was 101 Films here in the UK finally gave it a Blu-ray release. I don't think there's a Blu-ray release in the US for it at the moment, but the fractured global rights of this movie means wherever you're listening to this podcast in the world, I can't give you any definitive really outside of the UK as to how to get hold of the film. Now, I do really like the film. I always really enjoyed the film, tonal ups and downs notwithstanding, but the aftermath of it was, it's been pretty much forgotten, really. And in fact, for Daniel Petri Jr., I mean, he was just moving on at speed. He would reunite with Mike Medavoy, actually, for the Arnold Schwarzenegger headline The Sixth Day. I've talked about that in a previous podcast. But as he said to me, after Toy Soldiers, I went back to my deal at Disney. He said, we developed a couple of things that came close for me to do as a director, but they didn't gel. And then Disney had a picture that they knew they were going to make money on if only they could get a screenplay and a director. And Petri Jr. wanted to make another film. He said it was a window of opportunity they were eager to take advantage of. And that's how I ended up directing and co-writing the film In the Army Now with Paulie Shaw. That's one that's not coming up in a future episode of Film Stories. And as Petri Jr. himself says, it is not my favourite film. Toy Soldiers, though, a hidden gem worth seeking out. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not completely bored you to sleep by this point, then you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Our website, filmstories.co.uk, which is about to be updated. I think we're getting a slightly new website. Don't get too excited. It's updated every weekday with news, features, reviews, and you can find that filmstories.co.uk. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find our 37 issues of Film Stories magazine, our 10-ish different issues of Film Junior, and our Sneakers Blu-ray. They're all available for sale there. They're at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. That's it. I'm really stumbling over this time, aren't I? YouTube.com/filmstories. But the main thing, as always, it really is as always as well, is that you all stay safe and well and you all take care of yourselves. I've got a run of special in conversation episodes of Film Stories coming up over the next couple of weeks as extra episodes, which will be coming out as well. But your regular episode will be back every Monday as always. So I'm off to watch a load more films to get right in the next one. Until then, you all look after yourselves. You all take care. Be back soon with some more Film Stories. Bye-bye.